Queer theory is a very complex and even contradictory concept to unwrap, and there are many definitions of queer theory, as well as what is queer. Some queer theorists suggest that categories related to gender and sexuality extend beyond the confines of what can be defined, making it incredibly difficult to know exactly what falls under queer theory.
What comes to mind when you hear the word queer? In the past, at its best, queer was used as slang to describe a homosexual, and at its worst, it was used as a means of homophobic abuse. Queer was also used as a derogatory term that described same sex interactions and attractions. But regardless of the context, queer in the past was not something that people used as part of their sexual identity. However, more recently, our use and understanding of queer has changed. Today, many people use queer as a kind of umbrella term to apply to any sexual identity or interaction that falls outside of the heteronormative cisgender experience. And since the 1990s, queer has been applied to a theory of human sexuality that explores power dynamics and the ways that they impact sexual minorities. Queer continues to be a somewhat ambiguous term, even when we're talking about queer theory. But we'll begin this module by looking at some of the basic tenets of queer theory.
Fitzgerald and Grossman describe queer theory as a critical analysis of the social construction of sexuality, particularly ideas of sexual binary and essentialism. It opposes gender and sexuality classifications as limiting and instead embraces the concepts of gender and sexuality as fluid or in flux. It shouldn't be surprising, then, that you'll see a lot of overlapping between the ideas of queer theorists and some of the social constructionists that we looked at in Module 4A and 4B, especially given that many people think of queer theory as a critical analysis of social construction. One of the things that makes queer theory unique is the way in which it challenges not only essentialism, but the idea of the sexual binary, that is, homosexual and heterosexual, and sexual and gender classifications generally speaking. Queer theorists often view these categories as limiting as well as a form of social control, and instead think that the best approach to understanding the reality of human sexuality is to consider the way in which sexuality is fluid, in flux, and has the potential to change.
We'll introduce queer theory here, but I want to stress that this is just an introduction to some of the key tenets of queer theory. Queer theory is complex and deep, and if you're interested, there are entire courses you can take that will help you to delve into the various concepts that are part of queer theory. Most people associate the emergence of queer theory with academic developments in the 1990s. During this period, there was a rise in the development of lesbian gay studies in universities, but they often occurred within the confines of very traditional academic structures and discourse. There was also a number of voices emerging from lesbian feminists that were arguing that the claims made related to sexual minorities, especially those that came out of the gay liberation movement, were embedded with a masculinist bias and really didn't speak to their experiences. And we also have post structuralists who at this time were reframing the ways in which we think about key sociological concepts like power and identity. For example, recall the work of Foucault, who is bringing attention to power dynamics within society, as well as how societies created networks of power. Outside the university, there was this emergence of a really vivid activist movement that focused on sexual inequality. And these movements were different than the earlier gay liberation movement because they focused on people who faced multiple oppressions. For example, People of color were arguing that racial hierarchies needed to be examined when looking at the experiences of sexual minorities. AIDS and HIV activists brought forth multiple stigmas associated with an HIV status, and post colonialists were looking at the impact of colonial rule on gender and sexuality in post colonial places. Now, while all this is emerging both inside and outside the context of the university, there was a parallel development in terms of what was considered queer. And queer as a word was being used both inside and outside the academy, but no longer as just a synonym for being gay. Rather, queer became a response to the normative language within academic disciplines and thought of as a category that could really extend beyond the confines of how gender and sexuality had been traditionally defined. Queer, in other words, was used as a response to earlier identity politics that were now being critiqued as limited and narrow. Thus, the emergence of queer theory can be viewed as both a continuation and a break of earlier discourse, debates, and theories, and social movements related to sexual minorities. It further illustrated the movement from black and white to the various shades of gray that exist within any society when thinking about sexuality and gender from a social perspective. Despite the ambiguity of the word queer and queer theory as a perspective, most scholars argue that queer theory is made up of three interrelated projects. The first is refusing heterosexuality as a benchmark for sexual formations. In other words, queer theory challenges the notion of heteronormativity. Second, queer theory also challenges the binary, specifically the sexual binary of heterosexuality and homosexuality. Queer theorists argue that there are multiple ways in which individuals can identify and behave as sexual actors. Even within a single category, queer theorists stress this variation to illustrate the problematic nature of categories. One of the early campaigns for queer theorists was to illustrate that gay and lesbian studies was not a single entity and had to encompass a multitude of different experiences. And finally, queer theorists focus on intersectionality, looking at the intersection of race, class, ethnicity, and how they all shape various sexual biases.